All right, welcome. Enon has built this program on a very interesting idea. There are 4 composers on this program. Each wrote a piece for one of his friends who was a virtuoso performer, and each composer tailored that piece specifically to that friend's talents and personality. Debussy wrote his string quartet for his good friend, the great Belgian violinist Eugène Ysaÿe. Britten wrote his cello sonata for his good friend, the Russian cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. Stravinsky wrote his 3 movements from Petrushka for Arthur Rubinstein, who was not really one of his good friends, but they knew each other. We're making a connection. And Mozart wrote his clarinet quintet for one of his closest friends in Vienna, the clarinetist Anton Stadler. I'm going to call this talk not what it says up here, but instead a tale of friendship, because all 4 of the composers on this program wrote these pieces for a specific friend, and all 4 of those friends gave the premiere performance of these pieces. In a sense, each piece we hear this afternoon is a combination of its creator and its performer, almost as if it were a child that shows the characteristics or the DNA of both of its parents. One of the nice things about this concert, and this is different from much of the music that I talk about, is that these are not all names from the misty past. And in fact, I'm willing to bet that there are people in this room who have heard some of these performers live. So I'll begin with a question, and I want to see hands. How many people in this room heard and saw Rostropovich live? All right, a lot of you. Is there anyone here who's heard and saw Arthur Rubinstein live? Hey, okay. He's been retired for 40 years, or retired 40 years ago, and still there are people who heard him play live. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about the music, but I want also to talk about the performers for whom it was written and how those performers helped shape this music. Debussy wrote his string quartet specifically for the great Belgian violinist Eugène Ysaÿe. Ysaÿe was one of the greatest violinists of all times. Carl Flesch called him the most outstanding and individual violinist I ever heard in my life. And Pablo Casals said that he felt that he had never really heard a violinist play in tune until he heard Ysaÿe play. Ysaÿe was so great a musician that when he died in 1931, Belgium declared the day of his funeral a day of national mourning. That's nearly 100 years ago, and Ysaÿe can seem like somebody out of the distant past, except for the fact that we can still hear him play. In 1912, Ysaÿe went into a studio in New York City and made a series of recordings. They're now over 100 years old, and there's a lot of surface noise, but today, 90 years later, we can still hear Ysaÿe play Brahms. I should tell you one fun fact. Ysaÿe played one of the greatest violins ever made, the 1740 Guarneri del Gesù. It is a glorious instrument. It had a wonderful sound, and it was very powerful. In 1965, 30 years after Ysaÿe died, that violin was bought by Isaac Stern, who played it for the rest of his life. How many people in this room heard Isaac Stern live? All right, then you heard that violin, and that's Isai's violin, and that was the violin you heard in that scratchy old recording. Here's how that violin sounded when Stern played it in 1979. Let's go back to Debussy. Debussy met Isai when the composer was still a very young man. Isai was a huge man, and Debussy was very small. And Debussy said that Isai treated him as if he were his little brother. Debussy wrote his only string quartet in 1893, and when he was writing it, he knew that Isai and his string quartet would give the first performance of that piece. We tend to think of Debussy as an impressionist, somebody who wrote misty music about water lilies, and the beginning of the string quartet is full of slashing power. Debussy knew who was going to play it, and he wrote for that performer. This is music of real power and virtuosity. It is not sedate chamber music, the kind of music fit for a living room. It's music that should be played in a big hall, and it will reach out violently across that entire hall. That opening bit that I just played is essentially the backbone of the entire piece. That theme will come back in a variety of forms, and it will evolve all the way across the piece. One of the pleasures of this music is just following Debussy's imagination as he makes that one idea grow. Debussy said that he wanted the second movement to sound as if it were being played by a giant guitar. He gives the viola the theme, but the other three players strum their instruments as if this quartet really were a guitar. The recapitulation of this movement is even better. If you want to hear a string quartet really sound like a gigantic guitar, listen to this transition passage. I'm going to skip over the third movement, which is the longest movement in the quartet and also the most beautiful. It's so beautiful, in fact, that some string quartets actually play it separately as an encore at the end of concerts. It is just that attractive music. But I'm going to let you discover it for yourselves because I want to go on to the finale. After that slow, soft movement, the finale begins very quietly. It picks up speed, and suddenly it turns tough. Once again, this is very surprising music from Debussy. This is a very powerful movement. It's like that all the way through. And as it proceeds, we begin to hear intimations of that opening theme from the very beginning. Gradually, it comes back in all of its power. And this piece ends almost with a kind of symphonic strength. It is that big music. At the end, first violin flashes up across 3 octaves and nails that final chord. And as you listen to the ending, I want you to think about the violinist this quartet was written for, and the first violinist who ever played it, Eugène Issai. All right, the early reviewers didn't much like this string quartet. They criticized it as being fantastic and undignified. Today, we regard it as one of the greatest of all string quartets. Debussy would go on to write a very different kind of music, but I think that in this one piece at least, we feel the impact of a particular performer for which it was written. I'm going to jump ahead now 70 years to 1960 when Mstislav Rostropovich gave the London premiere of Shostakovich's first cello concerto. Shostakovich came to London for that concert, and he invited Benjamin Britten to sit in his box with him and hear the concert, and afterward he introduced the cellist and Britten. Both men were surprised by that meeting. Britten was amazed by Rostropovich's playing, and Shostakovich later said that all through that concert, Britten was popping up and down in his chair as he listened to Rostropovich play. Rostropovich knew Britten only through his records, and so he had no sense of him except from his music. He met him expecting a gigantic man, and Britten actually was very, very small. So both of them were surprised. They both got along famously. They became very close friends. And over the next few years, Britten wrote 5 different pieces for cello, specifically for Rostropovich to play. The cello sonata that we'll hear this afternoon is the first of these. Britten wrote it immediately after meeting Shostakovich, and back in Russia, Shostakovich kept bugging him. I want to see it, I want to see it, when are you going to send it? Finally, Rostropovich got a note from his post office in Russia saying that there was a packet for him from England, and Rostropovich said that I broke the 880-meter hurdle record for cellists to get down to the post office and get the score. Some of you heard Rostropovich play live, and I want to remind you what a powerful player he was. Here's the opening of his performance of Brahms' Double Concerto. Rostropovich was a very powerful person, both musically and politically. And as you know, he was thrown out of the Soviet Union in 1974 for criticism of the government. Now, though, 13 years before that, Britten writes a cello sonata for him right away. And as you listen this afternoon, you might ask if you sense the influence of Rostropovich's playing on the music that Britten wrote for him. The two of them gave the premiere at the Aldeburgh Festival in July of '61, and a couple of days later they recorded it, so I'm going to use their recording. This is a very compact sonata. It's in 5 movements, but it lasts for only 20 minutes, so the movements are quite short. I'm not going to take you through it in detail. I want to show you a couple of places. Second movement is a scherzo, and Britten says that the entire movement is to be played pizzicato. Britten, so very much like the second movement of the Debussy quartet, Britten described this movement too as guitar-like, and he has the piano play staccato all the way through, so it sounds like plucked strings. Here's a bit of that. Fourth movement is a tough little march, and I'd like you in this movement to listen to the kinds of sounds that Britten asks the cellist to make. He wants one passage played ponticello, which is right on top of the bridge, so it makes a hollow, grainy, buzzing sound. And then he gives the cello a long passage in glissando, so the cellist is sliding his finger up and down the string. Listen for the variety of sounds he writes for Rostropovich. Finale is a perpetual motion, and it really goes. This is the virtuoso movement we've been expecting all along, written specifically for Rostropovich's powerful playing. Britten would go on to write 4 more pieces for cello for Rostropovich, 3 suites for solo cello and the big symphony concerto. But he wrote no other music for cello. He met Rostropovich, they became very close friends. He wrote 5 pieces for him, and that was the end of Britten's interest in the cello. He was writing only for friends. Igor Stravinsky and Artur Rubinstein were friends, and they respected each other, but they were not particularly close. We remember Rubinstein mostly as a very old man. He was 95 when he died in 1982. But he was a child prodigy who had given his first recital at age 5. He toured Europe, the United States, South America, and he was famous while still a young man throughout the world. He was particularly famous for his performances of Chopin. But Rubinstein also played a great deal of 20th century music, though we don't think of him much as a champion of new music. He played Faya, Villalobos, Szymanowski, and others. In the program note, I tell the story of how Rubinstein approached Stravinsky and asked him to make a piano version of Petrushka, Stravinsky's ballet, so that Rubinstein could play it on his recital. He paid Stravinsky 5,000 francs, and that was a lot of money in 1921. And Stravinsky set to work. But Stravinsky decided that he didn't want just to write a piano transcription of the ballet, so he made a new piece from the ballet. You all know the famous beginning of Petrushka. It's set in Russia during the Shrovetide Fair. It begins with all the bustle and excitement of that fair. Petrushka is one of those pieces that just plain sound good. Debussy described it as sonorous magic. But Stravinsky knew that he couldn't make a solo piano sound like a whole orchestra, so he didn't try, and he dumps the whole beginning of the ballet, which we just heard. In the orchestral version of the ballet, there is a prominent role, though, for solo piano, and we hear it in the first movement when the old magician, the sorcerer who has the puppet show, touches each of the three puppets, the ballerina, Petrushka, and the Moor, and each of them come to life and they jump up and dance the Russian dance. Here it is. First touch. And they jump up here. And so Stravinsky cuts the entire beginning, and he begins his piano version at exactly that point with the Russian dance. The other two pieces are basically transcriptions of two other movements from Petrushka. In the movement called Petrushka Trapped in His Cell, Stravinsky creates one of those famous sounds. It's called the Petrushka sound. It's bitonal. He has one clarinet in C major, the other clarinet in F sharp minor, or F sharp major, and they clash. Here. And that same passage as scored just for piano. Rubinstein did pay Stravinsky 5,000 francs for this transcription, and Rubinstein did play it fairly regularly, but he never made a commercial recording, so I can't let you hear Rubinstein play it. That was actually Maurizio Pollini. The three pieces from Petrushka do get played fairly often. They're probably the best piano piece that Stravinsky ever wrote, and they are certainly the hardest piano piece that Stravinsky ever wrote, and they're hard specifically because they were written for a very, very good pianist. Final work on the concert is one of the greatest pieces of chamber music ever written, Mozart's clarinet, composed in 1789, only 2 years before his death. Mozart wrote it for the great clarinetist Anton Stadler, who was one of his close friends in Vienna. This concert is a program of music written for or inspired by great performers, and I've been able to let you hear Isai, Rostropovich, and Rubinstein, but I'm not going to be able to let you hear Anton Stadler, who died 100 years before Isai made that recording. By all accounts, Stadler was the first great clarinetist, though in fact he didn't play the clarinet, he played the basset clarinet, which is an early version of the clarinet. Stadler and Mozart were extremely close. They belonged to the same Masonic lodge in Vienna. Mozart is known to have lent him money. And over the last several years of his life, Mozart wrote a great deal of music for clarinet, specifically for Stadler to play. There is this quintet, there is the clarinet concerto, there are the great accompanied arias in the opera Clemenza di Tito, and in his late symphonies, Mozart wrote all of that music with Stadler in mind. We can't hear Stadler play, but maybe we can get some idea of his playing from the music that Mozart wrote for him. This is the clarinet quintet is not virtuoso music like the three pieces from Petrushka. There's nothing flashy or brilliant here. It's polished, refined music, and we feel that from the first instant. The clarinet is a very agile instrument, and some composers write specifically for that agility. If you know the clarinet works of, say, Carl Maria von Weber, he has the clarinet all over the place, and he assumes that it's a virtuoso instrument and should be doing that. Mozart was aware of that side of the clarinet, but I think he was much more drawn to the sound of the clarinet and the way it can mirror the sound of the human voice. At the start of the second movement, Mozart mutes all the stringed instruments and he gives the clarinet a soft singing line, almost as if this were an aria from an opera. Mozart believed that every wind instrument had a specific personality, and he would write music suited to what he thought the character of that instrument was. For Mozart, the clarinet was an infinitely expressive instrument, but he also saw a playful side of the clarinet as well. It could be a folk instrument that played country music. In his Symphony No. 39, written just the year before this clarinet quintet, the third movement is a Ländler. It's an Austrian country dance, and Mozart has the clarinet dance the Ländler in that symphony. He does a similar thing in the third movement of the quintet. The clarinet, which had been so expressive in the first movement, now dances with a happy, bucolic abandon. We expect a virtuoso finale, a chance for the clarinetist to show off, and that is exactly what Mozart doesn't do. Instead of a rondo finale, he concludes with a theme and variation movement, and the theme has a childlike simplicity to it. This is a fun movement, and the clarinet gets to dance here, but Mozart was Mozart, and in the midst of all this gaiety, he slows things down and writes a long adagio, as if he can't forget that the clarinet is an expressive instrument. The adagio catches the character of the clarinet perfectly, and in this passage, I at least get some sense of the artist that Stadler probably was. Rather than writing a fancy show-off finale for him, Mozart pauses to give him here some really beautiful music as a way of saying goodbye. I've called this talk A Tale of Friendship, and it presents music written by four virtuoso performers by composers who knew those performers well. The style and talents of those four performers shaped every one of these pieces. Eugene Isai, Mstislav Rostropovich, Artur Rubinstein, and Anton Stadler have all been dead for many years, but this concert will be full of ghosts. As we listen to music by Debussy, Britten, Stravinsky, and Mozart, we'll sense how much the character and the playing of those four great performers shaped these pieces. All of this music would have been very different if it had been written for somebody else. This concert really will be a tale of friendship. Enjoy it.